All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name's Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, out here in Budapest, Hungary. Today is November 2nd, 2023, and this is our daily live stream for today. And I only got an hour until my next class, so I'm using my break time to come in here and chop it up with y'all at the end of the day. So whether you're watching this now, live, or if you're watching this later, I want to say thank you. Like, subscribe, share, all that. Stay tuned because we are always on the grind on this channel. So let's get to it. You know who this man is on the screen right here. This is one of our heroes, one of our idols. This is the one, the only Malcolm Little, then later became known as Malcolm X, and then El Haj Malik Al Shabazz, one of the greatest Americans to ever exist. And he is definitely somebody who has influenced my life, changed my life for the better. And his legacy lives on, and we remember this brother so much. So we love and appreciate Malcolm X on this channel, and we're not going to dick ride too hard. But if there's anybody that you should dick ride, it is Malcolm X, because he is the exemplary man. He is the man that we should all try to be. You get what I'm saying? But anyway, I just want to read this article that I found from Malcolm X, and it was talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this article is not hard to find. It's actually very famous, and I'm ashamed of myself that I'm actually reading this late in life. Now, you guys already know how I feel about Israel, Palestine, and everything going on in the Middle East right now. I just don't care. Kanye shrug. I don't care. I'm all about fighting white supremacy and anti-blackness. And one of the things our brother Malcolm got wrong, and yes, we can criticize Malcolm because we've learned since then, we have learned that the Arabs, the Jews, the Israelis, the off-whites of all stripes and kinds do not love black people. They do not love us. They are not on our side, and Islam will not unite us. No religion will unite us. No nationality will unite us, because all of them are united in anti-black racism. That does not mean that we still don't advocate for what is right and fight for justice for all people, but we have to remember that advocating for other people's causes will not make people then reciprocate. So this is something that Malcolm got wrong, because towards the end of Malcolm's life, Malcolm was talking about we need to unify under Islam. Islam can cure racism in America and all that sort of stuff. And this was something I wholeheartedly believe too. And to some degree, I still do believe, which is why I still identify as a Muslim, because Islam is the only religion that is explicitly anti-black racism. But until we get to that point where people wake up and realize how big of a problem white supremacy is and anti-blackness is, I can't unite with anybody, especially the Arabs, when it comes to their issues. Until they're on our side, we're not rocking with them. But let's read Malcolm X's article, The Zionist Logic. So the Zionist armies that now occupy Palestine claim their ancient Jewish prophets predicted that in the last days of this world, their own God would raise them up a Messiah who would lead them to their promised land, and they would set up their own divine government in this newly gained land. This divine government would enable them to rule all other nations with a rod of iron. If the Israeli Zionists believe their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, then they also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its divine mission to rule all other nations with a rod of irons, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched even than that of the former European colonial powers. Very interesting how he's framing this. Malcolm is saying right here that the Zionists believe that God told them that they are due to inherit this land from people who cast them out when they cast them out with rods of iron, meaning brute force, and that if the Zionists do return, they're going to have to fulfill their divine right by acting with that same iron fistedness that the empires before did. Very, very true, because that's how empires form, and that's how you maintain power over land. These Israeli Zionists religiously believe their Jewish God has chosen them to replace the outdated European colonialism with a new form of colonialism, so well disguised that it will enable them to deceive the African masses into submitting willingly to their divine authority and guidance, without the African masses being aware that they are still colonized. Very interesting how he's referring referring to the African masses, because generally we view the Middle East as separate than Africa, even though it is on the African plate, the tectonic plate. And I hate when people say that, oh, the Middle East is technically Africa because, it's on the African plate, but we don't define geographic borders by the plates. We don't look at tectonic plates. Nobody can see tectonic plates, but that's a separate issue. Either way, this is very interesting what he's talking about here, because I believe Malcolm was killed in 1964. And basically, Israel wanted to be admitted into the United Nations. And many of the African nations who were newly independent voted against Israel because of what they were doing to the Palestinians. And then eventually, the African nations were cudgeled into voting for Israel to join the United Nations, I believe, if I remember right. And that's how we are where we are today in regards to Israel now being a part of the League of Nations. Even though many other nations have committed sanctions against Israel, they've all been blocked by the U.S. because of the U.S.'s seat on the UN Security Council. But yeah, I think he's referring to the African masses as far as the African nations that were voting against Israel being a part of the United Nations. Shout out to the Black Mind. He jumped in here. Congo is dying. Free Africa. Absolutely. Yep. We need to free Africa. We need to be worried about what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Eritrea, what's happening in Gabon, what's happening in South Africa, what's happening in Nigeria, what's happening in Mali, what's happening in Niger. We need to be worried about what we need to do for our people, not the Israelis, not the Palestinians. Who gives a flying F what happens in the Middle East? Does not matter, because both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict hate on Black people. So they aren't our friends. So shout out to the Black Mind. So Black Mind said, is there an African country in the European Union? Yeah, it's called France. France is the black country in the European Union. Anyway, let's go on to what Malcolm X was talking about here. Camouflage. The Israeli Zionists are convinced they are successfully camouflaged. They have successfully camouflaged their new kind of colonialism. Their colonialism appears to be more benevolent, more philanthropic, a system with which they rule simply by getting their potential victims to accept their friendly offers of economic aid and other tempting gifts that they dangle in front of the newly independent African nations whose economies are experiencing great difficulties. See, I knew he was talking about the African nations admitting Israel into the EU, not the EU, the UN, but you get me. During the 19th century, when the masses here in Africa were largely illiterate, it was easy for European imperialists to rule them with force and fear. But in this present era of enlightenment, the African masses are awakening, and it is impossible to hold them in check now with the antiquated methods of the 19th century. I love Malcolm X's globalist view, and especially his view on Africa, that Africa as a united bloc in the United Nations, if we voted collectively as a power, right, that we would be able to dictate some things in the world. We would have more of a seat at the table. I believe there's a quote from Malcolm X that says something like, the global South makes up the majority of seats in the UN, and if they voted as a bloc, they would be able to finally, get some reparations or recompense for what happened during the age of colonialism. So what Malcolm X is thinking here, and in this writing, is talking about how injustices in the past against the global South and people in the third world or developing nations can now be used as force. Because they divided up Africa into 54 countries, now we got 54 votes at the UN. Let's jump into the comments right here. Ozzy says, good evening, Simon in chat. Yo, shout out to Ozzy all the time. We're here building. We're here talking about Malcolm X, reading about his views on Palestine and Israel and that sort of stuff. So shout out to all of y'all. So let's go here to the next part. The imperialists, therefore, have been compelled to devise new methods, since they can no longer force or frighten the masses into submission. They must devise modern methods that will enable them to maneuver the African masses into willing submission. The modern 20th century weapon of neo-imperialism is dollarism. The Zionists have mastered the science of dollarism, the ability to come posing as a friend and benefactor, bearing gifts and all other forms of economic aid and offers of technical assistance. Thus, the power and influence of Zionist Israel and many of the newly independent African nations has fast become even more unshakable than that of the 18th century European colonialists. And this new kind of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive or objective. I like how Malcolm is talking here talking about how the Zionists want to try to influence Africa through money because, keeping us economically deprived as a people, as Black people, makes us, how can I say this? More susceptible to be used and abused. When you're a person who doesn't have anything, or people that don't have anything or very little means, we're more easily swayed and bought out when people wave dollars or euros in our faces. And that's what he's talking about here, how the Zionists are trying to influence African nations to be on the Israeli side. I have to say this as well. During my time in Africa, I saw a lot of people waving Israeli flags or putting it on the side of their buses or cars or outside of business windows. You see a lot of Israeli flags in Kenya, at least. I remember seeing that a lot. Not much in Mauritius, not much in Tanzania, but a lot of Israeli flags in Kenya when I was in Mombasa. And that's crazy because Mombasa in that area is a pretty Muslim country. Either way, let's continue building. At the close of the 19th century, when European imperialists wisely foresaw that the awakening masses of Africa would not submit to their old method of ruling through force and fears, these ever scheming imperialists had to create a new weapon and to find a new base for that weapon. Dollarism. The number one weapon of 20th century imperialism is Zionist dollarism. And one of the main bases for this weapon is Zionist Israel. The ever scheming European imperialists wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate and sow the seed of dissension among African leaders, and also divide the Africans against the Asians. Very interesting viewpoint that Malcolm has here. Malcolm is saying that essentially Israel is a colonial state created by the former colonial powers to make sure that they can continue to influence neo imperialism into the 21st 20 at the end of the 20th century and beyond into the next century, the 21st century that we're in now. Very interesting theory, and I think there is some credence in that. I mean, when we look at it, the Israelis have a passport that allows them to travel all throughout the EU and all to the Americas as well. Israel and the US are like this, and every other major powerful European nation is backing up Israel 100% right now during their campaign against Gaza. So yeah, it is a very solid argument to some degree. And once again, it's very hard to understand this relationship that Israel has with these other countries. Because, if I'm the US president or if I'm the leader of France, what real what real reason do I have to support Israel now? What real reason do I have to flood their country with billions of dollars, sell them even more weapons? What benefit does it do now? It only blows back. Because let's keep it real. Let's keep it absolutely real. What America is doing right now with Israel and Palestine, supporting Israel 1,000% while they kill innocent civilians and children and women and that sort of stuff. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, the next generation of, you know, the guys who yell Allahu Akbar and blow themselves up, those guys are going to be coming and they're going to want revenge. Because let's keep it real. Anytime the West has messed with the Arab world does not forget and they do not forgive. Let's keep it absolutely real. Uh, George W. Bush sent troops to Saudi. George Bush, not George W. Bush, the daddy, the first George Bush, sent troops to Saudi Arabia in the early 90s. And then 10 years later, 9/11 happens. I mean, they don't care. The people who are really about that Allahu Akbar lifestyle, they really going to get their get back about Israel and Palestine and what's happening now. So everybody in the West should really be worried. I don't want that to happen, but how the leaders are really doing this Israeli conflict, I really don't see any benefit to continue to support Israel like this. Yet and still, Malcolm is giving, once again, from the grave, Malcolm has proven to be one of our most profound thinkers. And what he is saying here about Israel and Palestine is very dope. He's saying that essentially Israel is an extension of neo-imperialism because an imperialist needs to have their base near the people they are trying to subjugate. And when we look at the map, Israel is right in the middle of the Middle East, and it's only a stone's throw away from Africa. Very dope. I'm not buying into it fully. I just find this a very interesting theory. So Ozzy says Israeli flags in sub-Saharan Africa. What the f? Yeah, it's true. It's true. And the videos of my wife and I's adventures in Kenya will be coming out soon. So subscribe to my other channel, Backpack Bandits. Anyway, Uh, so the number one weapon of 20th century imperialism is Zionist dollarism. And one of the main bases for this weapon is Zionist Israel. The ever scheming European imperialist wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate and sow the seed of dissension among African leaders, and also divide the Africans against the Asians. Zionist Israel's occupation of Arab Palestine has forced the Arab world to waste billions of precious dollars on armaments, making it impossible for these newly independent Arab nations to concentrate on strengthening the economies of their countries and elevate the living standard of their people. And the continued low standard of living in the Arab world has been skillfully used by the Zionist propagandists to make it appear to the Africans that the Arab leaders are not intellectually or technically qualified to lift the living standards of their people, thus indirectly inducing Africans to turn away from the Arabs and towards the Israelis for teachers and technical assistance. Very true, because this is one of the talking points that pro Zionist people make. Once again, guys, please remember I don't care about the Israeli Palestinian conflict at all, but I am aware of the arguments of both sides. And one of the arguments the Zionists make is that the Arabs are backwards. The Arabs can't take care of their people. Their leaders are despots and thieves. And the Arabs generally want to live like in the Stone Age time and according to Islamic law and Sharia. This is a general, like, I'm not saying that's what I believe. I'm saying that's what a lot of Zionists say. They say the Arabs didn't take care of this land. When the Zionists showed up in Israel back in 1920 or whatever, they found basically a wasteland, and then they started buying land and develop it, and now the Arabs are mad. And so what Malcolm is saying here, the Zionists are saying, because they get so much funding from the West and they are able to use the dollars to develop so quickly. And meanwhile, the Arabs are left behind because the West is not giving them so much money. This makes the Zionists look like a more appealing partner to Africans and Asian and Arab and other people who want in the third world rather than turning to the Arabs, right? And Malcolm, of course, is going to have more affinity for the Arabs because he is a newly converted Sunni Muslim, right? We have to remember the context of who is writing these pieces, where they are coming from, and where their biases may lie. So let's continue reading. They cripple the bird's wing and then condemn it for not flying as fast as they. The imperialists always make themselves look good, but it is only because they are competing against economically crippled, newly independent countries whose economies are actually crippled by the Zionist capitalist conspiracy. They can't stand against fair competition, thus, they dread Gamal Abdel Nasser's call for African Arab unity under socialism. I have to chastise Malcolm a bit here because I never once heard of Gamal Abdel Nasser talking about African unity. Gamal Abdel Nasser was an Arab nationalist. If you don't know who he was, Gamal Abdel Nasser was an army colonel who took over the Egyptian government and became like their first or second president, something like that, right? And Gamal Abdel Nasser ended up joining Egypt with Syria into one country. And yeah, he wanted to join all of the Arab world into one country, is what he thought it should be, right? But then, but Malcolm, unfortunately, and I hate to say this about my brother, I hate to say this about, we have to remember that's because of, what he saw towards the end of his life and what we didn't know before he died. Malcolm didn't know that the Arabs inherently have a lot of anti-black racism in them, and Malcolm was projecting his pro-black unified Arab black African unity onto other Arabs. That is not in their mind at all. So, I'm going to continue reading here. uh, Messiah. If the religious claim of the Zionists is true, that they were to be led to the promised land by their Messiah, and Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of that prophecy, where is their Messiah, whom their prophet said would get the credit for leading them there? It was United Nations mediator Ralph Bunche, who negotiated the Zionists into possession of occupied Palestine. And I'm gonna keep it real. I should have pulled this guy's picture up, but Ralph Bunche was a black man from the United States who is a diplomat who convinced the African nations to allow Israel to join the UN. And this is why, guys, this is why we have to call out our coon class. This is why we have to call out our coon class, because what Ralph Bunche did on behalf of the United Nations when Israel was doing blatant apartheid, when Israel was kicking out people from their homelands, when Israel was saying, y'all Arabs, y'all got to go and never come back, when they created the Nakba, and then Ralph Bunche, a black man who came from America and probably had his grandparents run from racist KKK MFs. You get what I'm saying? To go up and represent the United States as a black man, to then go negotiate with black African leaders that they need to accept a racist apartheid regime, which was Zionist Israel. That's coon behavior. That is absolute coon behavior. So Ralph Bunche is not one of our heroes. Malcolm is one of our heroes. Guys like Ralph Bunche are not. Absolutely not. And if y'all don't know who Ralph Bunche is, y'all go look him up. So, yeah, house ninja. Ozzy said he's a house ninja because he's very light skinned. Yep, it's always, but this is the thing. We can't judge him because Malcolm was very light skinned. Malcolm had red hair. Malcolm had red hair and he was super light skinned too. So listen, we don't judge our brothers or sisters based on their skin. We don't do colorism over here. We judge them by what they say. And Malcolm always spoke truth to power, even if he got it wrong. Even if Malcolm got it wrong, he always spoke truth to power. You get what I'm saying? But Ralph Bunche and a lot of other Negroes, yeah, they didn't. And they worked on behalf of the devil. Anyway, I'm going to continue. Is Ralph Bunche the Messiah of Zionism? If Ralph Bunche is not their Messiah and their Messiah has not yet come, then what are they doing in Palestine ahead of their Messiah? Did the Zionists have the legal or moral right to invade Arab Palestine, uproot its Arab citizens from their homes, and seize all of Arab property for themselves just based on the religious claim that their forefathers lived there thousands of years ago? Only 1,000 years ago, the Moors lived in Spain. Would this give the Moors of today the legal and moral right to invade the Iberian Peninsula, drive out its Spanish citizens, and then set up a new Moroccan nation where Spain used to be, as the European Zionists have done to our Arab brothers and sisters in Palestine? Exactly. I mean, this is a classic argument. I mean, the Zionists say, oh, our ancestors were here thousands of years ago. It is our ancestral homeland. Well, hell, people that looked like me conquered Spain thousands of years ago. If I say I'm a Moor, can I pull up in, I don't know, Madrid or Barcelona and say it's mine now? No, we can't. I mean, that's not how life works. But once again, I'm not getting in that Israeli Palestinian conflict. What's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. And Malcolm is just laying out some points here that I find very interesting. So, the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion. Where is their Messiah? Great writing for Malcolm X. Once again, we have to remember that Malcolm was a premier intellectual, a true organic intellectual. This was a man who had no formal education, spent a good chunk of his life in prison, came out a reformed individual, and ended up changing the world, and continues to teach us from the grave with his actual written words, his spoken words, and also his life. We love Malcolm over here, the greatest, one of the greatest black men that ever lived. But I want to talk about another great black man who had something to say about the small hat community or the untouchables. This is a brother that I think a lot of y'all have heard of, or maybe y'all don't know him, but you should know more about him. And that's our brother, our ancestor, James Baldwin. Gonna do a brief overview of who James Baldwin is before we read what he wrote. So, James Baldwin, full name James Arthur Baldwin, born August 2nd, 1924, New York, New York, died December 1st, 1987, in St. Paul, France. American essayist, novelist, and playwright whose eloquence and passion on the subject of race in America made him an important voice, particularly in late 1950s and early 1960s in the United States, and later through much of the Western world. And yeah, in general. So there's a great movie about James Baldwin called I Am Not Your Negro. You should go check that movie out after we watch this live stream. I only have 30 minutes left until I get to my next class, so I'm not going to read more of the bio, but all the links will be in the comment section or in the description of this video. So I want to read this article that James Baldwin wrote. And I find this very interesting. I did not read this beforehand, so I'm doing a live reaction of this text because the title is so striking. So I really want to know what James Baldwin is talking about here. So, Negroes are anti Semitic because they're anti white. That's a very deep deep, profound topic already. Now we have to remember James Baldwin lived in the 1950s, 60s when he was getting it on and being strong. You get what I'm saying? So the world back then was very different than what we know now. Like political correctness as a thing was not existent. There was still blatant anti-black racism that would be front and center in your face. Violence against black people was wild and out of control, and people were still working through these ideas of race, multiculturalistic societies, and that sort of stuff. And so the relationship between black people and Jewish people has always been a contentious one, I would say. So I'm very interested to hear what James Baldwin has to say in this article here. So Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, by James Baldwin. So when we were growing up in Harlem, our demoralizing series of landlords were Jewish, and we hated them. We hated them because they were terrible landlords and did not take care of the building. A coat of paint, a broken window, a stopped sink, a stopped toilet, a sagging floor, a broken ceiling, a dangerous stairwell, the question of garbage disposal, the question of heat and cold, of roaches and rats, all questions of life and death for the poor, and especially for those with children. We had to cope with all of these as best as we could. Our parents were lashed to futureless jobs in order to pay the outrageous rent. We knew that the landlord treated us this way only because we were colored, and he knew that he could not move out. And he knew that we could not move out. Very powerful here. So Avery Adams jumped into the chat. Shout out to Avery Adams. Y'all respect him. He's our top mod. He's we back up in this joint. Salute to Simon and salute to the chat. Lee Javid. Actually, Malcolm X is one of the greatest human beings who ever walked the earth. Absolutely, absolutely. We love Brother Malcolm on here. He is our spirit. He is our guide, and he is our force. But let's get back to this writing from James Baldwin. So he's talking about growing up in Harlem. He grew up very poor, and his landlord was Jewish, and basically his landlord kept him living in terrible conditions. And back then, the landlord didn't care about how his tenants lived because his tenants were black people. Very interesting right here. So the grocer was a Jew, and being in debt to him was very much like being in debt to the company store. The butcher was a Jew, and yes, we certainly paid more for bad cuts of meat than other New York citizens, and we very often carried insults home along with the meat. We bought our clothes from a Jew, and sometimes our secondhand shoes, and the pawnbroker was a Jew. Perhaps we hated him most of all. The merchants along 125th Street were Jewish, at least many of them were. I don't know if Grants or Woolworths are Jewish names, and I well remember that it was only after the Harlem riot of 1935 that Negroes were allowed to earn a little money in some of the stores where they spent so much. Very, very interesting. So, in this writing right here, James Baldwin is taking us back to how he grew up in his world. And growing up, the people that kept him in poverty were Jewish. The people that had made sure his house was in squalor wasn't Jewish. And the people that served him horrible food were Jewish as well. Once again proving this point that I've said before. A lot of Jewish people like to say, oh, we can't be racist, or we can't be anti-black, or we've never been anti-black, or we've always been on the side of black people, when time and time, while they might face discrimination from the whites, they damn sure to make sure to do discrimination and anti-black racism to us. And they've always used their wealth, privilege, and power to sure that we are subservient to them to some degree, or just to remind us that we are niggas. Let's keep it absolutely real. Let's keep it absolutely real. And I'm not just picking on the small hats here with this. I'm pointing out all the off-whites who do this to us. I know so at some point somebody's going to say Simon hates everybody. No, I don't hate anybody. I'm just pointing out anti-black racism because what this man grew up with is absolutely not cool. Now, let's say this was a white man writing an article and he was talking about all the drug dealers in my neighborhood were black, and all the criminals I saw on TV were black and stuff like that, right? Of course we would say, all right, you're being racist and you're being extreme here. And we can still have this same leeway with James Baldwin, as we see where this article goes. So I'm not giving him a pass on just saying all this stuff on Jewish people. I'm waiting to see where it goes. But I was just pointing out the fact that yes, these people do stuff to us that is hurtful to our communities. I'm going to continue reading here. Not all of these white people were cruel. On the contrary, I remember some who were certainly as thoughtful as the bleak circumstances allowed, but all of them were exploiting us, and that was why we hated them. But we also hated the welfare workers, of whom some were white, some colored, some Jewish, and some not. We hated the policemen, not all of whom were Jewish, and some of whom were black. The poor of whatever color do not trust the law and certainly have no reason so, and God knows we didn't. If you must call a cop, we said in those days, for God's sake, make sure it's a white one. We did not feel that the cops were protecting us, for we knew too much about the reasons for the kinds of crimes committed in the ghetto. But we feared black cops even more than white cops because the black cop had to work so much harder on your head to prove to himself and his colleagues that he was not like all the other niggers. Yo, there's a famous line in the NWA song "Fuck the Police" where Ice Cube says "Black police showing out for the white cops," and that's a real thing. I've even seen this in my own eyes. When you get pulled over by cops, at least in America, there's two of them usually in the car, or if there's not two of them in the car, one of them is in the car, and then he automatically calls back up. And the worst thing you could ever have happen to you in your life is getting pulled over by a white cop, and then a black cop comes and you're a black man, because you know he's gonna harass you, bro. And yeah, I'm just gonna leave it at that. And yeah, I'm just gonna say this. So James Baldwin is setting it up to say, essentially, we didn't specifically hate Jews when we were coming up in Harlem. We hated everybody who was exploiting us and hurting us. So I think he's making a very salient point here, because he's going to point out that the Jews like to hide behind their whiteness when it's convenient, but then run to their Jewishness when it's convenient as well. There was a joke. I was working in Miami at a sales office many years ago, and there was a joke one of the Jews told the other Jew who was in the office, and I just overheard it. And one of the Jews came to the guy and he said, if a bunch of Black Panthers ran into this office right now and said, we're killing all the white people, are you going to tell them you're Jewish? Are you white or Jewish? He said. That's what he really said. Yeah, the Jewish guy in my office told the other Jewish guy, if a bunch of crazy Black Panthers burst in here with guns and they say we're killing all the white people, are you white or you're Jewish? And then he said the second part of the joke. Dog. The other part of the joke was like, uh, a bunch of after the Black Panthers leave and you survive, a bunch of people come in with bags of money and they say everybody who's Jewish gets $1 million. Are you raising your hand or are you going to keep your hand down? I think I remember that joke. But yeah, that basically goes to show a lot of people who have some other background that other than what we consider Anglo white, they hide behind that other identity when it's convenient. And I think that's where James Baldwin is going. I'm going to jump into the comments here. So, oh yeah, that cop quote is famous from Baldwin. LOL, that's a funny joke. Anyway, but we also hated the welfare workers, of whom some were white, some colored, some Jewish, and some not. We hated the policemen. Okay, I already read that. So we hated many of our teachers at school because they so clearly despised us and treated us like dirty, ignorant savages. Not all of these teachers were Jewish. Some of them, alas, were Black. I used to carry my father's union dues downtown for him sometimes. I hated everyone in that den of thieves, especially the man who took the envelope from me, the envelope which contained my father's hard earned money, that envelope which contained bread for his children. Thieves, I thought, every one of you. And I know I was right about that. And I have not changed my mind. But whether or not all these people were Jewish, I really do not know. The army may or may not be controlled by Jews. I don't know and I don't care. I know that when I worked for the army, I hated all my bosses because of the way they treated me. I don't know if the post office is Jewish, but I would certainly dread working for it again. I don't know if Wanamaker's was Jewish, but I didn't like running their elevator and I didn't like any of their customers. I don't know if Nabisco is Jewish, but I didn't like clearing their basement. I don't know if Rikers is Jewish, but I didn't like scrubbing their floors. I don't know if the big white bruiser who thought it was fun to call me Shine was Jewish, but I know I tried to kill him and he stopped calling me Shine. By the way, Shine is a ancient, like a very old racial slur for black people, like call you shine, like shoe shine, like because you're black, like shoe shine. I don't know if the taxi driver who refused to stop for me was Jewish, but I know I hoped he'd break his neck before he got home. And I don't think that General Electric or General Motors or RCA or Con Edison or Mobil Oil or Coca Cola or Pepsi Cola or Firestone or the Board of Education or the textbook industry or Hollywood or Broadway or television or Wall Street, Sacramento, Dallas, Atlanta, Albany, or Washington are controlled by Jews. I think they are controlled by Americans. And the American Negro situation is a direct result of this control. And anti Semitism among Negroes, inevitable as it may be, and understandable, alas, as it is, does not operate to menace this control, but only to confirm it. It is not the Jew who controls the American drama, it is the Christian. Wow. Wow. Baldwin was an amazing writer. Baldwin was our he was our Shakespeare. Baldwin was one of our best and brightest. God bless this brother, even though he was on some bussy action. I don't know. Does God shine down on that? Yes, he does. God loves everybody. But yeah, man, very, very, very salient points he's making here. A lot of people like to say, "Oh, the small hats run the world. They run the media. They control the money and the finance." But it is not them. It's not them. Let's keep it real. There's no way a small proportion of people can control all these different industries. And even if they did, doesn't matter. Our problem is not with Jewish people. We do not hate Jewish people. We do not hate Israelis. We do not hate Zionists. We do not hate Arabs. We do not hate anybody. What we dislike is disrespect towards us as a people. Period. Period. And what every other single group of people have done is unify to make sure that we are subjugated. And that's what Baldwin is pointing out here. All these different aspects, these different companies, these different places and spaces make sure to keep their blacks on heel, at the bottom of the heel. And it is the Christian, it's truly the Christian, because we live in a world dominated by Christian nations like America, right? So yeah, very, very good points he's making. So Ozzy said Baldwin was the original passport bro. Yeah, he did go to France and get some bussy action on. Yeah, that's true. But he died in Paris, man. Hey, I would get tired of living in America too, especially growing up how Baldwin did in that time in America. Let's continue building here. The root of anti Semitism among Negroes is ironically the relationship of colored peoples all over the globe to the Christian world. This is a fact which may be difficult to grasp, not only for the ghetto's most blasted and embittered inhabitants, but also for many Jews, to say nothing of many Christians. But it is a fact, and it will not ameliorated, and it will not be ameliorated. In fact, it can only be aggravated by the adoption on the part of colored people now of the most devastating of the Christian vices. Of course, it is true, and I am not so naive as not to know it, that many Jews despise Negroes, even as their Aryan brothers do. There are also Jews who despise Jews, even as their Aryan brothers do. It is true that many Jews use shamelessly the slaughter of the 6 million by the Third Reich as proof that they cannot be bigots, or in the hope of not being held responsible for their bigotry. It is galling to be told by a Jew whom you know to be exploiting you that he cannot possibly be doing what you know he is doing because he is a Jew. It is bitter to watch the Jewish storekeeper locking up his store for the night and going home, going with your money in his pocket to a clean neighborhood miles from you, which you will not be allowed to enter. Nor can it help the relationship between most Negroes and most Jews when part of this money is donated to civil rights. In the light of what is now known as the white backlash, this money can be looked on as conscientious money merely, as money given to keep the Negro happy in his place and out of white neighborhoods. One does not wish, in short, to be told by an American Jew that his suffering is as great as the American Negro suffering. It isn't, and one knows that it isn't from the very tone in which he assures you that it is. Very poetic right here. And listen, there is no reason to compare suffering. There's no reason to compare, who went through worse things. The Holocaust was absolutely horrible and should not have happened, just as American slavery did not need to happen. We don't need to go back and forth with different communities about who had it harder. We don't need to do that. But we do have to understand that a lot of the times we are in predatory relationships with these other communities, even if they are oppressed as well. I want to ask you, how many Jews are signed to black record labels? How many Jews are signed to black record labels? Is Little Dicky or Drake? Drake is probably the exception. He was signed to a black man, a black American, Lil Wayne. But even then, Lil Wayne was signed to Cash Money, and Cash Money was signed to Universal, owned by a bunch of people that don't look like us, right? But by and large, we live in relationships with these people where they have the money and they employ us. It is very, very rarely the opposite way around. You get what I'm saying? There are black people who are going to fight and die in Gaza. They have millions, no, not millions. They have tens of thousands of black Ethiopian Jewish people in the IDF who are going to fight and die in Gaza. How many Jewish people are in the Nigerian army or the South African army? How many are in the armies of Mali or Burkina Faso? None. But we all fight and live and die for them. You get what I'm saying? So I'm not saying this to, bash on Jewish people. I want to make this absolutely clear. I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm just really finding it very powerful what Baldwin is saying here, talking about the relationship between this certain community and our community. We are anti-white supremacists, and the Jews have been practicing a lot of anti-black racism and exploitative relationships with us. This doesn't mean we hate them, and I honestly don't care about them. I'm keeping it absolutely real with you. So let's continue building here. For one thing, the American Jews endeavor, whatever it is, has managed to purchase a relative safety for his children and a relative future for them. This is more than your father's endeavor was able to do for you, and more than your endeavor has been able to do for your children. There are days when it can be exceedingly trying to deal with certain white musical or theatrical celebrities who may or may not be Jewish. What in show business is a name? But whose preposterous income cause one to think bitterly of the fates of such people as Bessie Smith or King Oliver or Ethel Waters. Furthermore, the Jew can be proud of his suffering, or at least not ashamed of it. His history and his suffering do not begin in America, where black men have been taught to be ashamed of everything, especially their suffering. Wow, powerful. So Lee Javin said, I can't help but remind all people that it can be very difficult to compare a 6-year Holocaust to 400 years of black slavery. Absolutely. It's hard to compare those things, and both things are tragic, and we shouldn't even be comparing them. But people should not try to equate themselves with us, because we don't try to equate ourselves with them. You get what I'm saying? When the Jewish people start talking about the Holocaust, I don't start talking about, the bombing of Black Wall Street. I sit there, I listen, and I empathize. But as soon as we start talking about our stuff, oh man, let me tell you about the 6 million. We get you about the 6 million. We all learn about the 6 million, but nobody cares about these 60 million black people. Yes, that is the number, because if we count the Arab slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, around 60 million black people lost their lives or went through years of suffering until the end of their days due to the capture of our people. Anyway, I'm going to continue building. The Jew suffering is recognized as part of the moral history of the world, and the Jew is recognized as a contributor, so the world's history is a contributor to the world's history. This is not true for the blacks. Jewish history, whether or not one can say it is honored, is certainly known. The black history has been blasted, maligned, and despised. The Jew is a white man, and when white men rise up against oppression, they are heroes. When black men rise, they have reverted to their native savagery. The uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto was not described as a riot, nor when the participants maligned as hoodlums. The boys and girls in Watts and Harlem are thoroughly aware of this, and it certainly contributes to their attitudes towards the Jews. Very true. There is a double standard. Whenever certain groups fight for their independence or freedom, oh, they're heroes. Oh, that was an uprising. But when we protest Mike Brown getting shot with his hands up, or Trayvon getting shot in the back by some security guard at a community complex, oh, y'all are rioting. Oh, y'all are savages and all that sort of stuff. Absolutely true. But of course, my comparison of Watts and Harlem with the Warsaw Ghetto will be immediately dismissed as outrageous. There are many reasons for this, and one of them is that while America loves white heroes armed to the teeth, it cannot abide bad niggers. But the bottom reason is that it contradicts the American dream to suggest that any gratuitous, unregenerate horror can happen here. We make our mistakes, we like to think, but we are getting better all the time. Well, to state it mildly, this is a point of view which any sane or honest Negro will have some difficulty holding. Very few Americans, and this includes very few Jews, wish to believe that the American Negro situation is as desperate and dangerous as it is. Very few Americans and very few Jews have the courage to recognize that the America of which they dream and boast is not the America in which the Negro lives. It is a country which the Negro has never seen. And this is not merely a matter of bad faith on the part of Americans. Bad faith, God knows, abounds. But there is something in the American dream sadder and more wistful than that. No one, I suppose, would dream of accusing the late Moss Hart of bad faith. Near the end of his autobiography, Act One, just after he has become a successful playwright and is riding home to Brooklyn for the first time in a cab, he reflects, I started through the taxi window, a pinch faced 10-year-old hurrying down the steps on some morning errand before school, and I thought of myself hurrying down the streets on so many gray mornings out of a doorway in a house much as this one. My mind jumped backwards in time and then whirled forward like a many faceted prism, flashing our old neighborhood in front of me, the house, the steps, the candy store, and then shifted to the skyline I had just passed by, the opening last night, and the notices I still hugged tightly under my arm. It was possible in this wonderful city for that nameless little boy, for any of its millions, to have a decent chance to scale the walls and achieve what they wished. Wealth, rank, or an imposing name counted for nothing. The only credential the city asked was the boldness to dream. But this is not true for the Negro, and not even the most successful or fatuous Negro can really feel this way. His journey will have cost him too much, and the price will be revealed in his estrangement, unless he is very rare and lucky for other colored people and in this continuing isolation from whites. Furthermore, for every Negro boy who achieves such a taxi ride, hundreds at least will have perished around him, and not because they lacked the boldness to dream, but because the Republic despises their dreams. Wow. Let's get into the comments real quick. Ozzy says, Lee Javid, also the Holocaust didn't only target Jews, Gypsies, blacks, any non-Aryans. Absolutely. Oh, so perhaps one must be in such a situation in order really to understand what it is. But if one is a Negro in Watts or Harlem and knows why one is there and knows that one has been sentenced to remain there for life, one can't but look on the American states and the American people as one's oppressors. For that, after all, is exactly what they are. They have corralled you where you are for their ease and their profit, and are doing all in their power to prevent you from hiding out enough about yourself to be able to rejoice in the only life you have. One does not wish to believe that the American Negro can feel this way, but that it is because the Christian world has been misled by its own rhetoric and narcotized by its own power. For many generations, the natives of the Belgian Congo, for example, endured the most unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the Belgians, at the hands of Europe. Their suffering occurred in silence. This suffering was not indignantly reported in the Western press as the suffering of white men would have been. The suffering of this native was considered necessary, alas, for European Christian dominance. And since the world at large knew virtually nothing concerning the suffering of this native, when he rose, he was not hailed as a hero fighting for his land, but condemned as a savage hungry for white flesh. The Christian world considered Belgium to be a civilized country, but there was not only no reason for the Congolese to feel that way about Belgium, there was no possibility that they could. Very, very powerful what he's saying here. He's saying that when such brutality and violence is enacted on a people, like, for example, the Belgian Congo, and when it is done in the name of Christendom or when it's done in the name of some moral high ground, people justify it. People find reasons to justify harming other people when it's done in some grand name. And that's what was done to our people many times. The Europeans came to Africa and colonized us and said that they were doing it to bring us to God, to bring us to Jesus, to bring us enlightenment, to turn us from our savage ways. And then in turn, the Congolese, of course, they hated and resented the British or the French or the Belgians who were conquering them. And so then they cannot see any humanity in them. Very powerful what Baldwin is saying here. One of our greatest writers. So, what will the Christian world, which is so uneasily silent now, say on that day which is coming when the black natives of South Africa begins to massacre the masters who have massacred him so long? It is true that two wrongs don't make a right, as we love to point out to the people we have wronged, but one wrong doesn't make a right either. People who have been wronged will attempt to right the wrong. They could not be people if they didn't. They can rarely afford to be scrupulous about the means they will use. They will use such means as come to hand. Neither in the main will they distinguish one oppressor from another, nor see through to the root principle of their oppression. In the American context, the most ironical thing about Negro anti Semitism is that the Negro is really condemning the Jew for having become an American white man. Powerful. Powerful, powerful, powerful. But I think, Baldwin, you're standing alone because, I have no beef with Jews at all. I don't hate Jewish people. And I'm not saying that James Baldwin hates Jewish people. I just feel like he wrote this article to be intentionally shocking, to get people's attention, to point out the collection of Caucasians and people who identify as whites collectively doing things to keep us suppressed and subjugated. I think he titled this article, Black American Negroes or Black People are anti-Semitic because we're anti-white. That's just a shocking title that gets people to read it, right? Because if it was really, well, there's a nuanced view on how to look at race and racism and the relationship between blacks and Jews, titles like that don't get clicks. I know for a fact what doesn't get clicks because my channel is super small and this channel is BS because it's I get limited views. I know what doesn't work and Baldwin knew what did work. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, in the American context, the most ironical thing about Negro anti-Semitism is that the Negro is really condemning the Jew for having become an American white man, for having become, in effect, a Christian. The Jew profits from his status in America, and he must expect Negroes to distrust him for it. The Jew does not realize that the credential he offers, the fact that he has been despised and slaughtered, does not increase the Negro's understanding. It increases the Negro's rage. Deep. For it is not here and not now that the Jew is being slaughtered, and he is never despised here as the Negro is, because he is an American. The Jewish travail occurred across the sea, and America rescued him from the house of bondage. But America is the house of bondage for the Negro, and no country can rescue him. What happens to the Negro here happens to him because he is an American. Very, very deep sentence here. What happens to the Negro here happens to him because he is an American. Very, very deep sentence from James Baldwin. When an African is mistreated here, for example, he has recourse to his embassy. The American Negro who is, let us say, falsely arrested will find it nearly impossible to bring his case to court. And this means that because he is a native of this country, one of you niggers, he has effectively no recourse and no place to go, either within the country or without. He is a pariah in his own country and a stranger in the world. This is what it means to have one's history and one's ties to one's ancestral homeland totally destroyed. This is not what happened to the Jew, and therefore he has allies in the world. That is one of the reasons no one has ever seriously suggested that the Jew be violent. There was no need for him to be nonviolent. On the contrary, the Jewish battle for Israel was saluted as the most tremendous heroism. How can the Negro fail to suspect that the Jew is really saying that the Negro deserves his situation because he has not been heroic enough? Very deep. I think a lot of people around the world look at Black Americans and say, why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they run in the Capitol like the Trump people did on January 6th? Why didn't they try to start their own nation? Why don't they have a secessionist movement? Why don't Black Americans have the equivalent of Hamas? Why? Why? Because we are a moral and upright people who do not hate and we are not vengeful. I repeat, Black Americans and Black people in general, I would say, I believe this extends to all of us. We are not vengeful and we are not hateful people. After everything that happened to us, you will not find any serious Black person who truly thinks that says that they hate white people or that they hate Jewish people or that they hate Hispanics or they hate Arabs or Turks or anybody. Nobody hates anybody on our side. We are not a vengeful people. We don't want to slaughter them. We don't want heads to roll. We don't want to hang them for trees or cut off their dicks like they did to us. We don't want to do that. And the whole world looks at us. And I think a good portion of them look at us and say, why don't y'all do that? Because we would do that. If we were Hungarians oppressed in America, we would do that. If we were Serbs oppressed in America, we would do that. If we were Chinese in America and we were oppressed like that, we would do that. But we don't, because we're a moral and upright people, and we understand that we don't want to become the demon that has oppressed us. That's what I honestly think. But I honestly think that's why a lot of people around the world also don't respect us. But that's a deeper topic for another day. Anyway, it is doubtful that the Jews could have won their battle had the Western powers been opposed to them, but such allies as the Negro may have are themselves struggling. All right, but such allies as the Negro, many who are struggling for their freedom against tenacious and tremendous Western opposition. I believe there's a typo here or something like that. But such allies as the Negro may have are themselves struggling for their freedom against tenacious and tremendous Western opposition. I understand that sentence now. He's referring to the African nations who are fighting for their independence or were fighting for their independence at the time. This leaves the American Negro, who technically represents the Western nations, in a cruelly ambiguous position. In this situation, it is not the American Jew who can either instruct him or console him. On the contrary, the American Jew knows just enough about this situation to be unwilling to imagine it again. Finally, what the American Negro interprets the Jew as saying is that one must take the historical, the impersonal point of view concerning one's life and concerning the lives of one's kinsmen and children. We suffer too, one is told, but we came through, and so will you in time. In whose time? One has only one life. One may become reconciled to the ruin of one's children's lives is not reconciliation. It is the sickness unto death. And one knows that such counselors are not present on these shores by following this advice. They arrived here out of the same effort the American Negro is making. They wanted to live and not tomorrow, but today. Now, since the Jew is living here, like all the other white men living here, he wants the Negro to wait. And the Jew sometimes, often, does this in the name of his Jewishness, which is a terrible mistake. He has absolutely no relevance in this context as a Jew. His only relevance is that he is white and values his color and uses it. He is singled out by Negroes not because he acts differently from other white men, but because he doesn't. His major distinction is given by that history of Christendom, which has so successfully victimized both Negroes and Jews. And he is playing in Harlem the role assigned him by Christians long ago. He is doing their dirty work. Very dope, very interesting what he's saying here. No more than the good white people of the South, who are really responsible for the bombings and lynchings, are ever present at these events. Do the people who really own Harlem ever appear at the door to collect the rent? One risks libel by trying to spell this out too precisely, but Harlem is really owned by a curious coalition which includes some churches, some universities, some Christians, some Jews, and some Negroes. The capital of New York is Albany, which is not a Jewish state, and the Moses they sent us, whatever his ancestry, certainly failed to get the captive children free. A genuinely candid confrontation between American Negroes and American Jews would certainly prove of inestimable value. But the aspirations of the country are wretchedly middle class, and the middle class can never afford candor. What is really at question is the American way of life. What is really at question is whether Americans already have an identity or are still sufficiently flexible to achieve one. This is a painfully complicated question, for what now appears to be the American identity is really bewildering and sometimes demoralizing blend of nostalgia and opportunism. For example, the Irish who march on St. Patrick's Day, who do not, after all, have any desire to go back to Ireland. They do not intend to go back to live there, though they may dream of going back there to die. Their lives in the meanwhile are here, but they cling at the same time to those credentials forged in the old world, credentials which cannot be duplicated here, credentials which the American Negro does not have. These credentials are the abandoned history of Europe, the abandoned and romanticized history of Europe. The Russian Jews have no desire to return to Russia either, and they have not departed in great clouds for Israel. But they have the authority of knowing it is there. The Americans are no longer Europeans, but they are still living, at least as they imagine, on that capital. The capital also belongs, however, to the slaves who created it for Europe and who created it here. And in that sense, the Jew must see that he is part of the history of Europe and will always be considered by the descendant of the slave. Always, that is, unless he himself is willing to prove that his judgment is inadequate and unjust. This is precisely what is demanded of all the other white men in this country, and the Jew will not find it easier than anybody else The ultimate hope for a genuine black white dialogue in this country lies in the recognition that the driven European serf merely created another serf here, and he created him on the basis of color. No one can deny that the Jew was a party to this, but it is senseless to assert that this was because of his Jewishness. One can be disappointed in the Jew if one is romantic enough for not having learned from history, but if people did learn from history, history would be very different. All racist positions baffle and appall me. None of us are different from one another, neither that much better nor that much worse. Furthermore, when one takes a position, one must attempt to see where the position inexorably leads. One must ask oneself, if one decides that black or white or Jewish people are, by definition, to be despised, is one willing to murder a black or a white or a Jewish baby? Wow, Baldwin always takes it there. Baldwin had to take it there. Okay, so if racism is really real, if other people are really inferior, go and murder their babies. Like, that's crazy. Like, Baldwin, he didn't have to take it there to make a point. That was a bit extreme. Anyway, to murder a white or Jewish baby, for that is where the position leads. And if one blames the Jew for having become a white American, one may perfectly well, if one is black, be speaking out of nothing more than envy. If one blames the Jew for not having been ennobled by impression, one is not indicate no, if one blames the Jew for not having been ennobled by oppression, one is not indicting the single figure of the Jew, but the entire human race, and one is making a quite breathtaking claim for oneself. I know that my own oppression did not ennoble me, not even when I thought of myself as a practicing Christian. I also know that if today I refuse to hate Jews or anybody else, it is because I know how it feels to be hated. I learned this from Christians, and I cease to practice what the Christians practice. The crisis taking place in the world and in the minds and hearts of black men everywhere is not produced by the Star of David, but by the old rugged Roman cross on which Christendom's most celebrated Jew was murdered, and not by Jews. Very, very eloquent and beautiful writing from James Baldwin right here. Listen, don't get caught up on the title of this text. No, James Baldwin does not hate Jews. No, Simon Hill keeps it trail does not hate Jews. Malcolm X does not hate Jews. Nobody hates Jews. Nobody actually cares about y'all. What we want is for y'all to get off our backs and stop messing with us. Stop bothering us, and we'd be cool. And this goes to all people who practice anti-black racism. So that's really the end of my live stream. I want to shout out to Ozzy, Lee Javed, Avery Adams, and the Black Mind. Thanks for watching this live stream. See y'all next time. Peace.